I still remember the exact moment my world shifted. Sunday dinner at my house had become a weekly tradition since my sister Brenda moved in 8 months ago with her twin daughters. The dining room buzzed with conversation as we gathered around the oak table my father built years before he passed. My 7-year-old son, Jacob, bounced excitedly in his chair, clutching a crumpled math test with a bright red B+ scrawled across the top. His learning differences made schoolwork challenging, so this grade represented weeks of effort and late-night study sessions together. When he proudly announced his achievement, expecting the praise he deserved, Brenda glanced up from her phone with that familiar smirk I had grown to dread. She looked directly at my precious boy and said, "Some kids are just born behind," then laughed mockingly. Jacob quietly set down his fork, his bright smile crumbling into devastation. The fury that erupted from my chest surprised even me as I snapped, "Behind like how you and your kids are still in my house eating my groceries." Brenda froze mid-laugh. Mom whispered urgently, "Thaddeus, please." But the damage was done, and 8 months of buried resentment exploded across that dinner table. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Brenda's face shifted from shock to indignation, her manicured fingers gripping her wine glass until her knuckles turned white. "Excuse me?" She hissed, her voice dripping with the entitled tone I had heard countless times since her divorce from Marcus last year. The wealthy lifestyle she had grown accustomed to during her marriage evaporated when she discovered her husband's gambling debts, leaving her with nothing but designer clothes and an attitude that the world owed her comfort. "You heard me perfectly," I replied, standing from my chair as Jacob slipped away toward his bedroom, shoulders slumped with humiliation. 8 months, Brenda. 8 months of you living here rent-free while I work double shifts at the hospital just to keep food on this table. My voice rose with each word, years of suppressed frustration pouring out like water through a broken dam. Her twin daughters, Sophia and Emma, sat frozen in their seats, their usually chattering mouths silent for once. At 9 years old, they had inherited their mother's sharp tongues and had spent months making snide comments about Jacob's learning pace, calling him slow when they thought I couldn't hear. The irony wasn't lost on me that their mother, who couldn't balance a checkbook or hold down a part-time job, was criticizing my son's intelligence. "How dare you embarrass me in front of my children?" Brenda snarled, her carefully applied makeup beginning to smudge as her face flushed with anger. "I'm going through a difficult time, and this is how family treats each other, with cruelty and resentment." Mom reached across the table, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she tried to mediate. "Please, both of you, let's calm down and discuss this rationally. Thanksgiving is next week, and we should be grateful for having each other." Grateful? I laughed bitterly, gesturing toward the expensive handbag Brenda had somehow acquired despite claiming poverty. Grateful that she spends her days at nail salons and coffee shops while I'm scrubbing hospital floors to pay for her lifestyle. Grateful that she tells people my son is an embarrassment to the family. Brenda's eyes widened with mock innocence, but I caught the flicker of panic that crossed her features. "I never said that. You're being dramatic and putting words in my mouth because you're stressed about money. Maybe if you had finished college like I suggested years ago, you wouldn't be struggling so much." The condescension in her voice made my blood boil. She knew exactly which buttons to push, having perfected the art of making others feel small while positioning herself as the victim. Struggling? I'm not the one who lost a 3,000 square foot house because I couldn't manage my finances. I'm not the one who moved back in with family after destroying my marriage with selfishness and poor choices. "That's enough," Mom interjected, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Even she had begun noticing the expensive purchases that appeared regularly despite Brenda's claims of financial hardship. Brenda stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sharp screech. "Fine. You want to know the truth, Thaddeus? Yes, I think Jacob needs special attention that you're clearly not capable of providing. And yes, I've been honest with people about his limitations because someone needs to advocate for that child's proper educational placement. The words hit me like physical blows. The thought of her discussing Jacob's private struggles with strangers painting him as deficient when he had been making genuine progress filled me with protective rage. You have been bad-mouthing my son to justify your own failures as a mother and a human being. At least my daughters aren't falling behind in school because I'm too proud to admit they need help. She shot back, her voice rising to match mine. Sophia and Emma shifted uncomfortably, clearly rehearsed in their mother's talking points about Jacob's supposed inadequacies. Your daughters are spoiled brats who think they're superior to everyone because you filled their heads with the same entitled nonsense that ruined your life. I replied, immediately regretting the harshness of my words toward children, even as frustrated as I felt. Brenda's expression transformed into something calculating and cold. She reached for her phone, typing rapidly with her thumbs as she spoke. I'm calling Marcus. He'll want to know about this hostile environment his daughters are being subjected to. Go ahead. I challenged, knowing her ex-husband had grown tired of her manipulation tactics months before their divorce was finalized. Call the man who changed his phone number twice to avoid your drama. That's when she delivered the blow I never saw coming. Setting down her phone with deliberate precision, Brenda smiled with venomous satisfaction. Actually, Thaddeus, I have some news that's going to change everything around here. I'm pregnant again, and I'm going to need even more support over the next several months. The baby's father isn't ready to commit yet, but that's what family is for, right? Taking care of each other during difficult times. The room fell completely silent except for the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mom's face went pale as she processed the implications while Sophia and Emma exchanged confused glances. My mind reeled with the realization that Brenda had just announced another mouth for me to feed, another responsibility to shoulder, as if her current presence wasn't already draining every resource I possessed. The father isn't ready to commit, I repeated slowly, understanding dawning with horrifying clarity. You're involved with a married man, aren't you? Her silence confirmed my suspicion, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me. This wasn't just about family obligation anymore. My sister had become a destructive force that threatened everything I had worked to build, everything I was trying to provide for my son. The kindness I had shown, the sacrifices I had made, the extra shifts I had worked to accommodate her needs, had only enabled behavior that grew more toxic by the day. Get out, I said quietly, my voice carrying a finality that surprised everyone at the table. What? Brenda blinked, as if she couldn't comprehend that her announcement hadn't generated the sympathy she expected. Get out of my house, tonight. Take your daughters and find somewhere else to live. I'm done being your safety net while you destroy my family. The following morning arrived gray and bitter, matching my mood as I nursed my third cup of coffee in the kitchen. Brenda had stormed out the previous evening, taking Sophia and Emma to Mom's house, while declaring she would return for her belongings when I came to my senses. The house felt different without their constant chatter and demands, peaceful, in a way I hadn't experienced in months. Jacob emerged from his bedroom still wearing his dinosaur pajamas and climbed onto the stool beside me at the breakfast counter. His eyes were puffy from crying, but he seemed calmer than he had in weeks. Dad, are Aunt Brenda and the girls really moving out? Yes, buddy. They're going to find their own place. I ruffled his sandy brown hair, noting how he didn't flinch away from my touch, the way he had been doing lately. How do you feel about that? He considered the question seriously, swinging his legs as he thought. I feel bad for being happy about it. Is that wrong? The honesty in his voice broke my heart. No, Jacob. It's not wrong to feel relieved when someone who was making you uncomfortable isn't around anymore. You don't have to feel guilty for wanting peace in your own home. After Jacob left for school, I decided to tackle the guest bedroom where Brenda had been staying. What I discovered there made my stomach turn with disgust and disbelief. Hidden beneath a pile of designer clothes I knew she couldn't afford were my missing credit cards, the ones I had assumed were misplaced during the chaos of daily life. Alongside them lay checkbooks from my account, several checks already filled out in amounts ranging from $200 to $800, all bearing forged versions of my signature. My hands shook as I continued searching, uncovering receipts for luxury purchases that made my modest salary seem like pocket change. A $500 handbag, $200 dinners at upscale restaurants, a $300 spa package. All charged to cards she had stolen from my wallet while I slept after exhausting shifts at the hospital. But the real punch to the gut came when I found my father's vintage toolbox empty, the specialized instruments he had collected over 30 years of carpentry work completely gone. A quick search on my laptop revealed several of his most valuable pieces listed for sale on various online marketplaces, complete with descriptions that claimed they belonged to a recently deceased relative whose family needed to liquidate assets quickly. The betrayal cut deeper than simple theft. Those tools represented my father's legacy, his craftsmanship, and dedication to his trade. Brenda had sold pieces of family history for quick cash while eating meals I paid for and sleeping under a roof I provided. A knock at the front door interrupted my investigation. Jacob's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, stood on the porch with a concerned expression that immediately put me on edge. A kind woman in her 40s with graying hair and gentle eyes, she had been working with Jacob since the beginning of the school year to address his learning challenges. "Mr. Thompson, I hope you don't mind me stopping by, but I've been worried about Jacob. His behavior has changed significantly over the past few months, and I wanted to discuss some concerning patterns we've noticed." I invited her inside, offering coffee as we settled in the living room. Her words confirmed my worst fears about the damage Brenda's presence had inflicted on my son. "Jacob has been having panic attacks during math class," Mrs. Rodriguez explained, her voice gentle but serious. "He becomes overwhelmed and starts hyperventilating when he makes even small mistakes. This is new behavior for him, and it's interfering with his ability to learn and participate in classroom activities." She opened a folder filled with documentation that painted a picture of my son's deteriorating emotional state. Additionally, someone called our office several weeks ago, claiming to be Jacob's aunt. This person informed our counselor that Jacob has significant intellectual disabilities that haven't been properly diagnosed and suggested we lower our academic expectations accordingly. The room seemed to spin as I processed her words. My sister called the school pretending to advocate for Jacob while actually sabotaging his education. I'm afraid so. The caller suggested that Jacob was being pushed too hard at home and that his learning differences were more severe than his official assessments indicated. She recommended that we stop challenging him academically and focus instead on basic life skills. Mrs. Rodriguez leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that Jacob's actual performance has been improving steadily. His reading comprehension has advanced 2 grade levels since September, and his mathematical reasoning shows genuine promise. The labels someone has been trying to place on him don't match the child I see in my classroom." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Brenda hadn't just been undermining Jacob's confidence at home. She had actively worked to limit his opportunities at school by convincing educators he was incapable of growth. Her cruel comments and constant comparisons to Sophia and Emma had been part of a systematic campaign to diminish my son's self-worth and potential. "There's something else," Mrs. Rodriguez continued hesitantly. "Jacob has mentioned that his aunt gives him special vitamins when he gets upset or anxious. He described them as white pills that make him sleepy and calm. I'm required to report any concerns about medication being administered without proper medical supervision." My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. Brenda had been drugging my child, giving him some form of medication to manage his natural responses to her abusive behavior. The drowsiness I had attributed to growth spurts and busy school days suddenly made terrifying sense. After Mrs. Rodriguez left, I called my bank to report the fraudulent charges and discovered the extent of Brenda's financial crimes. Over the past 8 months, she had systematically drained nearly $12,000 from my accounts through forged checks, stolen credit cards, and unauthorized electronic transfers. The customer service representative explained that some of the charges had been disputed and reversed by merchants after other customers complained about the same fraudulent purchasing patterns. "Sir, it appears your cards were part of a larger scheme we've been investigating. Several families in the area have reported similar theft patterns, always by a female relative who gained access to financial information through trusted family relationships." The revelation that Brenda might be running these scams on multiple families simultaneously filled me with horror and determination. How many other people had she victimized with her sob stories and manipulation tactics? How many other children had suffered under her toxic influence? As afternoon faded into evening, I sat surrounded by evidence of my sister's crimes, feeling foolish for having trusted her, and angry at myself for allowing the situation to continue for so long. But beneath the rage and disappointment, a steely resolve began forming. Brenda had declared war on my family through her actions, and it was time to fight back with every legal weapon at my disposal. The phone rang just as I finished photographing the evidence, startling me from my dark thoughts. The caller ID showed Mom's number, and I braced myself for another guilt-laden conversation about family loyalty and forgiveness. "Thaddeus, honey, Brenda is here crying and saying you threatened her last night. She says you're having some kind of breakdown and that she's worried about Jacob's safety. Are you feeling all right?" The manipulation continued even from a distance, I realized. Brenda was already working to control the narrative painting herself, as the concerned sister worried about an unstable brother. Her tears and dramatic proclamations would convince Mom that I was the problem, just as they had convinced others throughout our lives. "Mom, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Brenda has been stealing from me, forging checks, and selling Dad's tools online. She's also been giving Jacob unprescribed medication and sabotaging his education by calling his school with false information about his abilities." The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably before Mom's voice returned smaller and less certain. "That's a very serious accusation, Thaddeus. Are you sure you're not misunderstanding something? Brenda loves Jacob, and she would never hurt him intentionally. I have proof, Mom. Forged checks, stolen credit cards, and documentation from Jacob's teacher about the phone calls. This isn't a misunderstanding or a family disagreement. This is criminal behavior that's been going on for months." But even as I spoke, I could hear the doubt in my mother's voice, the reluctance to believe that her daughter could be capable of such calculated cruelty. Years of enabling Brenda's behavior had created blind spots that evidence alone might not be enough to overcome. The real fight was just beginning, and I knew that Brenda wouldn't go down without using every manipulation tactic in her arsenal to maintain her victim status while destroying my reputation and credibility. The battle lines were drawn, and my son's future hung in the balance. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected visitor to my doorstep. Detective Sarah Coleman from the county sheriff's office stood in my living room, her badge gleaming against her navy blue uniform as she examined the evidence I had carefully arranged on the coffee table. A woman in her early 40s with prematurely gray hair and sharp green eyes, she moved through the documentation with professional efficiency that gave me hope for the first time in days. "Mr. Thompson, these financial records paint a clear picture of systematic fraud," Detective Coleman said, photographing each piece of evidence with her department-issued camera. "The forged signatures alone constitute multiple felony charges, not to mention the identity theft and unauthorized use of financial instruments." I felt vindicated until she looked up from her notes with a serious expression that indicated more complicated news was coming. However, I need to inform you that we received a report yesterday evening from a concerned family member alleging that you've been exhibiting erratic behavior and making threats. The caller expressed worry about your son's welfare and suggested that you might be experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. The words hit me like a physical blow. Brenda had moved faster than I anticipated, using our mother as an unwitting accomplice to muddy the waters before I could present my case to law enforcement. Detective, that call came from my sister, the same person who committed these crimes. She's trying to discredit me before you could investigate her actions. Detective Coleman nodded knowingly. I suspected as much, which is why I wanted to speak with you directly before filing any reports. These types of family financial crimes often involve attempts to deflect blame onto the victim through character assassination. Her validation felt like a lifeline, but before I could express my gratitude, another knock echoed through the house. Through the front window, I could see Mom's familiar sedan parked behind the police cruiser, with Brenda's silhouette visible in the passenger seat. This is about to get interesting, Detective Coleman murmured, closing her evidence folder as I opened the door to face my family's next wave of manipulation. Mom entered first, her face etched with worry and confusion, followed by Brenda, who had clearly been crying, but whose tears looked calculated rather than genuine. Behind them trailed Sophia and Emma, both girls, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact with me. "Thaddeus, what have you done?" Mom demanded, gesturing toward the police car in my driveway. "Calling the authorities on your own sister instead of trying to work things out within the family like reasonable adults." Brenda immediately burst into fresh tears, her voice breaking with perfectly timed emotion. "Officer, I'm so scared. My brother has been acting increasingly unstable, and yesterday he threatened to throw me and my daughters out on the street with nowhere to go. I'm pregnant and vulnerable, and I don't know what he might do next." Detective Coleman introduced herself and calmly explained that she was investigating financial crimes, not domestic disputes. But Brenda pressed forward with her performance, producing her phone and scrolling to what appeared to be text messages. "So he's been sending me threatening messages all night," Brenda claimed, holding out the device for the detective to examine. "Look at these angry rants about how I'm ruining his life and destroying his son. This isn't normal sibling disagreement. This is genuine mental instability." I moved closer to see the messages, and my stomach dropped as I read texts I had never sent, conversations that had never taken place, and threats I had never made. The phone showed my contact information, but every word was fabricated, crafted to make me appear unhinged and dangerous. "Detective Coleman, I never sent any of those messages. I can show you my phone records to prove it," I said, reaching for my device, but Brenda quickly pulled hers away. "Of course he's going to deny it," she sobbed, turning to Mom for support. People in the middle of mental health crises often have no memory of their actions. I've been researching online, and this kind of paranoid behavior is textbook for someone having a psychological break. Mom wrapped her arms around Brenda protectively, her maternal instincts overriding any skepticism she might have felt about the situation. "Honey, maybe you should consider getting some help. The stress of raising Jacob alone, working so many hours, it's clearly taking a toll on your mental state. The betrayal of having my own mother question my sanity while defending my abuser felt like a knife twisting in my chest. Years of being the responsible one, the son who stayed close to home and took care of everyone else's needs, counted for nothing against Brenda's tears and manufactured evidence." Detective Coleman, however, seemed less convinced by the theatrical display. "Mrs. Thompson, creating false electronic communications is itself a crime. If these messages were fabricated to support false allegations, that constitutes additional charges beyond the financial crimes we're already investigating." Brenda's composure cracked slightly at the detective's implication, but she quickly recovered. "I have witnesses who can testify to my brother's strange behavior over the past several months. His co-workers have noticed changes in his personality, And even Jacob's school has expressed concerns about the home environment. Actually, Detective Coleman said, consulting her notes, I spoke with Jacob's teacher this morning, and she painted a very different picture. Mrs. Rodriguez reported that someone claiming to be Jacob's aunt has been interfering with his education by spreading false information about his capabilities. She also mentioned concerns about unprescribed medication being administered to the child. The color drained from Brenda's face as she realized her lies were unraveling faster than she could spin new ones. Mom looked between us with growing confusion, her certainty about family loyalty beginning to waver as contradictory information mounted. That's ridiculous, Brenda stammered. I would never give Jacob anything without Thaddeus's permission. Mrs. Rodriguez must be mistaken about who called the school. It was then that Jacob appeared at the top of the staircase, still in his school clothes from having arrived home while we were arguing. He'd been listening to the conversation, and his young face showed a determination I had never seen before. Aunt Brenda, you did give me pills, he said clearly, his voice carrying down to the living room, where we all stood frozen. You said they were special vitamins to help me think better, but they made me really sleepy in class. You gave them to me when I got upset about Sophia and Emma being mean to me. The silence that followed his words was deafening. Detective Coleman immediately asked Jacob to come downstairs, and with gentle questioning, she extracted a detailed account of the medication incidents that corroborated everything Mrs. Rodriguez had reported. Jacob, can you describe these pills for me? The detective asked, kneeling down to his eye level with practiced kindness. They were white and round, and Aunt Brenda kept them in a little bottle in her purse. She said they would help me be calm like Sophia and Emma, but they just made me want to sleep during math class. Detective Coleman turned to Brenda with steely professionalism. Ma'am, administering prescription medication to a child without parental consent or medical supervision constitutes child endangerment under state law. I'm going to need to examine those pills. Brenda's mask finally slipped completely as she realized the magnitude of her legal jeopardy. I was just trying to help him cope with his anxiety. He gets so worked up over schoolwork, and I thought a mild anti-anxiety medication might calm him down. It wasn't malicious, just misguided aunt trying to help. The admission hung in the air like an indictment. She had just confessed to drugging my child, while simultaneously trying to convince everyone that I was the unstable parent. Mom's face went ashen as the implications sank in. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw doubt creep into her eyes regarding Brenda's victim narrative. Ma'am, I need you to surrender any medications in your possession immediately. Detective Coleman commanded her tone, leaving no room for negotiation. And I'll be requesting a full toxicology screening for Jacob to determine what substances he was given and in what quantities. As Brenda reluctantly produced a prescription bottle from her purse, labeled with someone else's name, and containing anti-anxiety medication, I realized this was only the beginning of discoveries that would reveal the true extent of her criminal behavior. My sister wasn't just a thief and a liar, she was someone who would endanger a child to maintain control over a situation that benefited her financially and emotionally. The foundation of everything I thought I knew about family loyalty crumbled as I watched my son's brave honesty expose the person who had been systematically poisoning his mind and body while stealing from the very people who had offered her shelter and support. The emergency room at County General buzzed with controlled chaos as nurses hurried between curtained bays and monitors beeped steadily in the background. Jacob sat on the examination table, swinging his legs nervously as Dr. Patricia Williams drew blood for the toxicology screening that would determine exactly what medications Brenda had been giving him over the past several months. This won't hurt more than a quick pinch, buddy. Dr. Williams assured him, her gentle demeanor helping to ease his anxiety about the needle. A pediatric physician in her 50s with kind eyes and graying brown hair, she had immediately taken Jacob's case seriously when Detective Coleman explained the circumstances that brought us to the hospital. The blood work would take several hours to process, but preliminary urine testing had already confirmed the presence of lorazepam, a powerful anti-anxiety medication that had no business being in a 7-year-old's system. Dr. Williams explained that regular doses of such medication could cause cognitive impairment, memory problems, and the exact symptoms Mrs. Rodriguez had observed in Jacob's classroom behavior. The good news is that children are resilient, and any effects should be temporary once the medication clears his system completely, Dr. Williams told me as we stepped outside Jacob's hearing range. However, I'm legally obligated to report this as suspected child abuse to the Department of Children and Family Services. My stomach clenched at her words, even though I knew the investigation was necessary. DCFS involvement meant scrutiny of my parenting home environment and fitness as a guardian, all while I was trying to deal with the financial crimes and emotional trauma Brenda had inflicted on our family. Detective Coleman appeared in the hallway just as Dr. Williams finished explaining the mandatory reporting procedures. Her expression was grim but determined as she approached with an update that would change everything about how I viewed my sister's criminal activities. Mr. Thompson, I've been making calls to other jurisdictions while you've been here with Jacob. She began consulting a small notebook filled with her handwriting. Your sister's pattern of behavior extends far beyond what she's done to your family. She led me to a quiet corner of the waiting area where we could speak privately while still keeping Jacob in sight through the window of his examination room. What Detective Coleman told me next made my blood run cold. With the realization that Brenda wasn't just a troubled family member making poor choices, but a career criminal who had been systematically targeting vulnerable relatives for years. 3 years ago, Brenda lived with her elderly Aunt Margaret in Phoenix for 6 months. Detective Coleman explained reading from her notes. Aunt Margaret died suddenly of what was initially assumed to be natural causes, but the family became suspicious when they discovered that $23,000 had been withdrawn from Margaret's savings account in the weeks before her death. The words hit me like physical blows as I processed the implication that my sister might be connected to an elderly relative's death. Are you saying Brenda killed our aunt? The medical examiner found elevated levels of prescription medications in Margaret's system similar to what she was giving Jacob, but in much higher concentrations. The case was ruled suspicious, but Brenda had already moved out of state before investigators could question her thoroughly. Detective Coleman flipped to another page in her notebook, revealing a pattern of exploitation that spanned multiple states and numerous victims. After Phoenix, she moved to Denver and lived with her ex-husband's brother and his wife for 4 months. They reported similar financial crimes, forged checks, stolen credit cards, and missing valuable items that appeared for sale online. My mind reeled as I tried to reconcile the sister I thought I knew with the predator Detective Coleman was describing. How many families has she done this to? At least 6 that we've identified so far, possibly more. The pattern is always the same. She appears during a crisis period, presents herself as vulnerable and in need of temporary help, then systematically drains the financial resources while psychologically manipulating family members who try to set boundaries. The detective's phone rang, interrupting our conversation, and her expression grew even more serious as she listened to whoever was calling. After hanging up, she turned to me with news that made everything exponentially worse. That was the district attorney's office. Your mother called them this morning claiming that you've been making death threats against Brenda and her children. She's requesting a protective order and emergency custody modification for Jacob. The betrayal felt like a physical wound. Mom had chosen to believe Brenda's manufactured evidence over her own son's documented proof of criminal activity. Years of being the dependable child, the one who stayed close to help, with family obligations and responsibilities, counted for nothing against my sister's tears and manipulation tactics. Detective, I have never threatened anyone. My mother is being manipulated by someone who has made lying and manipulation into an art form. I believe you, Mr. Thompson, but we need to address these allegations seriously to protect your custody rights. The district attorney is sending someone to interview both you and Jacob about the family dynamics and any potential threats. As if the situation couldn't become more complicated, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message contained a link to a Facebook page where I found posts that made my stomach turn with disgust and disbelief. Brenda had created a public social media campaign portraying herself as a battered woman fleeing an abusive brother who had threatened her unborn child. The posts included edited audio recordings of our Sunday dinner argument, strategically cut to remove context and make my anger about financial theft sound like unprovoked verbal assault. Photos of Jacob looking tired or sad were accompanied by captions suggesting I was neglecting his medical needs and educational support. "She's gone viral," I said numbly, showing Detective Coleman the rapidly accumulating likes, shares, and sympathetic comments from strangers who believed they were supporting a vulnerable mother in crisis. "People are calling for my arrest and demanding that Jacob be removed from my custody." The comment section read like a lynch mob of keyboard warriors who had been fed carefully curated information designed to paint me as an unstable and dangerous man. Several people claimed they had contacted Child Protective Services on Brenda's behalf, while others suggested they had called my workplace to report my alleged mental health issues. Detective Coleman studied the posts with professional interest, noting details that escaped casual observation. These recordings have been edited and the photos appear to be taken out of context to support a false narrative. Creating fraudulent social media content to damage someone's reputation and parental rights constitutes criminal harassment and defamation. My phone rang with a call from my supervisor at the hospital, and my heart sank as I answered to hear concern in her voice about complaints the administration had received regarding my mental stability and fitness for duty. "Thaddeus, I know you're a good employee, but Human Resources has received several anonymous reports claiming you've been behaving erratically and making threats toward family members. I need you to come in tomorrow for a meeting with our employee assistance counselor." The systematic destruction of my reputation was happening faster than I could defend against it. Brenda had weaponized social media family relationships and institutional concerns to create a perfect storm that threatened my employment, my parental rights, and my standing in the community. But Detective Coleman's next words provided the first ray of hope I had felt since this nightmare began. "Mr. Thompson, I've been in contact with FBI Financial Crimes Division about your sister's interstate activities. They're opening a federal investigation into what appears to be an organized scheme targeting vulnerable family members across multiple jurisdictions." She explained that Brenda's pattern of behavior matched other cases the FBI had been tracking involving individuals who used family connections and manufactured crises to gain access to homes and financial resources before moving on to new targets when their crimes were discovered. The federal charges will include wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy if we can prove she's been coordinating these activities with other individuals. The penalties are much more severe than state-level financial crimes, and federal authorities have resources that local law enforcement can't match. As we spoke, Jacob emerged from his examination room with a small bandage on his arm and a brave smile that reminded me why I was fighting so hard to protect him from the toxic influences that had been damaging his young life. "Dad, Dr. Williams said the bad medicine will be gone from my body soon, and then I won't feel so tired in school anymore," he said, slipping his small hand into mine with trust that humbled me completely. Looking down at my son's hopeful face, I realized that Brenda's greatest mistake had been underestimating the lengths a father would go to protect his child. She had declared war on my family, but she was about to discover that her opponent possessed resources, determination, and legal support that her previous victims had lacked. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since finding those forged checks in her bedroom, I felt confident that justice would eventually prevail over manipulation and lies. The call came at 6:37 on a Wednesday morning, jolting me from the first peaceful sleep I'd experienced in weeks. Detective Coleman's voice carried a satisfaction that immediately lifted my spirits as I fumbled for the bedside lamp and tried to shake off the grogginess. Mr. Thompson, we have Brenda in custody. The warrant from Arizona was executed an hour ago, and she's being held pending extradition hearings for the charges related to your Aunt Margaret's death. I sat up straighter, processing the information that felt almost too good to believe after days of watching my reputation crumble under Brenda's social media assault. What happened? How did they find her so quickly? Your sister made a critical error in judgment, Detective Coleman explained with evident amusement in her professional tone. She tried to run. Yesterday evening, she purchased a one-way bus ticket to Portland using a credit card that triggered fraud alerts we had placed on her accounts. When she was arrested at the Greyhound station, she was carrying fake identification documents and over $3,000 in cash that she couldn't explain the source of. The detective's words painted a picture of desperation that was completely at odds with the confident victim narrative Brenda had been promoting online. Her flight attempt had provided law enforcement with additional evidence of consciousness of guilt that would strengthen the case against her in court. There's more good news, Detective Coleman continued. Marcus, her ex-husband, contacted our office yesterday with information that's going to blow this case wide open. Apparently, he's been keeping detailed records of Brenda's financial crimes during their marriage because he suspected she would eventually try to blame him for their bankruptcy. I dressed quickly and drove to the sheriff's office where Detective Coleman had assembled a comprehensive file that revealed the true scope of Brenda's criminal enterprise. Marcus sat in the conference room, looking exhausted but determined, his expensive suit wrinkled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. Thaddeus, I owe you an apology. Marcus began, his voice heavy with regret. I knew what kind of person Brenda was, and I should have warned you when she moved in with your family. I was just so relieved to have her out of my life that I didn't consider the damage she might do to others. He opened a thick folder containing bank statements, credit reports, and legal documents that chronicled years of financial manipulation and fraud that had ultimately destroyed his family's economic stability. She didn't just spend money we didn't have. She opened credit accounts in my name-forged loan applications, using my business as collateral, and even tried to take out insurance policies on my children with herself as the beneficiary. Detective Coleman spread the documents across the conference table, creating a timeline that showed Brenda's escalating criminal behavior over a 5-year period. What Marcus discovered, and what we've now confirmed through federal database searches, is that your sister has been running sophisticated financial scams since her early 20s. The pattern we identified across multiple states represents just the tip of the iceberg. The detective pulled out a map marked with red pins representing locations where Brenda had lived temporarily with various family members, leaving a trail of financial destruction and psychological trauma in her wake. 7 states, 14 families, and an estimated total of over $200,000 in documented losses. And those are just the cases where victims filed police reports. Marcus leaned forward, his expression grim, as he shared information that made my blood run cold with its implications. The most disturbing part is that she keeps detailed notes about her targets. We found journals in our old house where she analyzed family members' weaknesses, financial vulnerabilities, and psychological pressure points she could exploit. He produced photocopies of handwritten pages that read like a predator's playbook for emotional manipulation. Brenda had documented which family members responded to guilt tactics, which ones could be manipulated through their children, and which ones had financial resources worth pursuing through long-term deception. She wrote about you specifically, Thaddeus. Marcus continued, pointing to entries dated several months before her divorce was finalized. She identified you as an ideal target because of your single-parent status, stable income, and what she called your pathological need to be needed by family. Reading my sister's clinical analysis of my character felt like being dissected by someone I had trusted with my home and my child's welfare. She had studied my personality traits the way a burglar cases a house looking for weaknesses that could be exploited for maximum gain. Detective Coleman interrupted my horrified fascination with the journals to share news that provided some measure of satisfaction. The social media campaign she launched against you has backfired spectacularly. Our cybercrime unit identified the audio editing software she used to manipulate your dinner conversation, and several of the photos were proven to be taken out of context or digitally altered. She showed me screenshots of the Facebook posts that had caused me so much anguish, now marked with warnings about false information, and accompanied by comments from people who had realized they had been manipulated into supporting a criminal's lies. Even better, her attempt to discredit you actually led to other victims coming forward. 3 families saw her posts and recognized the same manipulation tactics they had experienced. We now have a federal task force coordinating investigations across multiple jurisdictions. The vindication felt overwhelming as I realized that Brenda's desperate attempt to destroy my reputation had actually accelerated the investigation that would ultimately bring her to justice. Her overconfidence in her ability to manipulate public opinion had exposed her to scrutiny that revealed the full extent of her criminal activities. Marcus pulled out another document that provided the most satisfying revelation of the entire morning. There's something else you need to know about Brenda's pregnancy announcement. I had my lawyer investigate the claim because she tried to use it to demand additional alimony payments from me. He handed me a medical report that confirmed what I had begun to suspect based on her behavior and timeline inconsistencies. She's not pregnant, Thaddeus. The whole thing was a fabrication designed to generate sympathy and create additional financial obligations for anyone supporting her. The pregnancy lie represented the peak of Brenda's manipulation tactics, a calculated deception designed to make me feel guilty about setting boundaries while creating long-term financial leverage she could exploit for years. The cruelty of using a non-existent child as an emotional weapon demonstrated a level of calculated malice that went far beyond simple selfishness or poor judgment. Detective Coleman gathered the documents as our meeting concluded, her expression reflecting the satisfaction of a professional who had successfully unraveled a complex criminal conspiracy. Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that the charges against your sister now include federal wire fraud, interstate transportation of stolen goods, identity theft conspiracy, and child endangerment. She's looking at a minimum of 12 years in federal prison, possibly much more depending on what our ongoing investigation uncovers. As I drove home from the sheriff's office, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was carrying. For months, I'd questioned my own perceptions and judgment, as Brenda's manipulation tactics made me doubt the evidence of my own eyes. The validation that her criminal behavior was extensive, systematic, and completely separate from any failures on my part provided emotional relief that was almost overwhelming. Jacob was waiting for me when I arrived home, his backpack ready for school, and his face showing a brightness that had been missing for months. Mrs. Rodriguez had reported that his classroom performance was improving dramatically as the medications cleared his system and the stress of his toxic home environment diminished. Dad, Mrs. Rodriguez says I might be able to join the accelerated reading group next month. He announced proudly, bouncing slightly with excitement about academic challenges that had previously seemed impossible. Looking at my son's renewed confidence and enthusiasm for learning, I realized that Brenda's greatest crime hadn't been the financial theft, or even the medication she had given him without permission. Her most devastating impact had been the systematic destruction of a child's self-worth and academic potential through constant criticism and artificial limitations designed to make him appear deficient. But those dark months were ending, and Jacob's natural intelligence and curiosity were emerging from under the shadow of manipulation that had been suppressing his growth. The nightmare was finally beginning to transform into a story of justice, healing, and the triumph of truth over calculated deception. 6 weeks after Brenda's arrest, I sat in the gallery of Federal District Court watching my sister face the consequences of her years of calculated criminal behavior. Dressed in an orange jumpsuit that was a far cry from her usual designer clothes, she looked smaller, somehow diminished by the removal of the props and personas she had used to manipulate her victims. Judge Patricia Harrison presided over the proceedings with the stern dignity befitting someone who had spent 23 years on the federal bench. A woman in her early 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, she had clearly read every document in the extensive case file that detailed Brenda's interstate crime spree. The courtroom was filled with an unexpected gathering of Brenda's victims' families from across the country who had traveled to witness her sentencing and share their stories of financial and emotional devastation. Marcus sat 2 rows ahead of me, flanked by his new wife Sarah and his 2 children, who had finally been freed from the toxic influence that had poisoned their family dynamics for years. Detective Coleman took the witness stand to present a comprehensive summary of the investigation that had expanded far beyond my initial complaint about forged checks and stolen credit cards. The scope of criminal activity she described was staggering in its breadth and systematic cruelty. Your Honor, the defendant operated what can only be described as a family predator network. Detective Coleman testified consulting notes that represented hundreds of hours of investigation. She targeted vulnerable relatives during crisis periods, then used emotional manipulation and manufactured emergencies to gain access to their homes, finances, and trust. The detective's presentation included audio recordings, financial documents, and witness testimony that painted a picture of sophisticated criminal enterprise disguised as family dysfunction. Brenda had maintained detailed records of her victims' psychological vulnerabilities, documented their financial resources, and planned her exit strategies before her crimes were discovered. The defendant's journals reveal premeditation and calculation that extends back at least 8 years, Detective Coleman continued. She studied her target's weaknesses with the thoroughness of a psychological profiler, then exploited their love and family loyalty to gain access to resources she had no intention of repaying. When Judge Harrison called for victim impact statements, I was surprised by the number of people who stood to share their experiences with my sister's manipulative criminal behavior. An elderly man from Colorado described losing his life savings to Brenda's fake medical emergency story. A single mother from Nevada explained how Brenda had stolen her identity and destroyed her credit while claiming to help her through a difficult divorce. But the most powerful testimony came from Marcus, who described the psychological damage Brenda had inflicted on his children through systematic manipulation designed to turn them against their father and undermine their sense of security. She convinced my daughter Emma that I didn't love her because I worked long hours to pay for the debts she was secretly accumulating. Marcus said, his voice breaking with emotion. She told my son that our family's financial problems were my fault, creating anxiety and fear that required months of therapy to address. When my turn came to speak, I focused on Jacob and the deliberate sabotage of his educational and emotional development that represented Brenda's most unconscionable crime. Your Honor, my sister didn't just steal money from my family. She systematically attempted to destroy my son's self-confidence and academic potential through constant criticism, unauthorized medication, and false reports to his school about his capabilities. She weaponized his learning differences to make him feel inferior, while positioning herself as an advocate when she was actually his primary source of emotional harm. I described the transformation in Jacob's classroom performance and psychological well-being since Brenda's removal from our lives, presenting documentation from Mrs. Rodriguez that showed dramatic improvement in his academic achievement and social confidence. Jacob is now reading at a 4th grade level, despite being only 7 years old. I testified, looking directly at Brenda as I spoke. He's been accepted into the school's gifted and talented program, proving that the limitations she tried to impose on him were entirely artificial and malicious. Judge Harrison listened to each statement with careful attention, taking notes that would inform her sentencing decision. When Brenda was given the opportunity to address the court, her words provided a final demonstration of the manipulative personality that had caused such widespread damage. Your Honor, I made mistakes, but everything I did was motivated by love for my family and desperation about my circumstances. She said, tears flowing freely as she employed the same emotional tactics that had worked so effectively in private settings. I never intended to hurt anyone, especially not my nephew Jacob, who I love deeply and only wanted to help succeed. The lies continued even in the face of overwhelming evidence as Brenda attempted to rewrite history and portray her calculated crimes as misguided attempts at family support. She claimed the medication she gave Jacob was recommended by online research, and that her interference with his education was based on legitimate concerns about his learning pace. Judge Harrison's response demonstrated that Brenda's manipulation tactics were ineffective against someone who had reviewed the documented evidence of her systematic criminal behavior. Ms. Thompson, the court has reviewed extensive documentation of your criminal activities spanning multiple states and numerous victims over a period of 8 years. Judge Harrison said her voice carrying the weight of moral authority that comes from years of distinguishing between truth and deception. Your crimes demonstrate a level of premeditation calculation and callous disregard for the welfare of others that goes far beyond financial desperation or family dysfunction. The judge's words provided validation for every victim who had suffered under Brenda's manipulation, acknowledging the psychological damage that extended far beyond simple financial loss. The court is particularly disturbed by your systematic abuse of a vulnerable child through unauthorized medication and deliberate sabotage of his educational development. Judge Harrison continued, your actions toward your nephew demonstrate a willingness to harm the most innocent victims to maintain your control and financial advantage. When the sentence was announced, the courtroom fell silent as the full weight of federal justice was brought to bear on Brenda's criminal enterprise. 15 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, with restitution orders totaling over $300,000 to compensate victims across multiple states. Additionally, Judge Harrison stated, you are permanently prohibited from residing with or having unsupervised contact with minor children, and your parental rights regarding your daughters Sophia and Emma are hereby terminated to protect their welfare from further manipulation and abuse. The termination of Brenda's parental rights ensured that Sophia and Emma would be protected from the toxic influence that had already damaged their psychological development through years of manipulation and emotional abuse. Marcus had already begun the legal process of adopting them officially, providing the stable and honest family environment they deserved. As the bailiff led Brenda away to begin her federal prison sentence, I felt a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. Relief that the nightmare was finally over and that Jacob would be protected from further harm. Sadness that family relationships had been so thoroughly corrupted by criminal behavior and manipulation, and determination to help my son heal from the trauma while building a life based on honesty, respect, and genuine love. The journalists who had covered the case approached me in the courthouse lobby, seeking comments about the resolution of what they had dubbed the Family Predator Network investigation. But I declined interviews, preferring to focus my energy on rebuilding the family bonds that Brenda's crimes had damaged and supporting other victims who were still recovering from similar experiences. Detective Coleman caught up with me as I prepared to leave the courthouse, her expression reflecting the satisfaction of a job well completed and justice appropriately served. Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that your willingness to come forward and fight back against your sister's manipulation probably saved other families from experiencing similar abuse, she said, shaking my hand with genuine respect. Cases like this often go unreported because victims feel ashamed or guilty about exposing family members to criminal prosecution. Her words reminded me that standing up to Brenda's abuse had protected not just Jacob and myself, but potentially dozens of other families who might have become targets of her criminal enterprise if she had been allowed to continue operating with impunity. As I drove home to collect Jacob from Mrs. Rodriguez's after-school care program, I reflected on the journey from that terrible Sunday dinner conversation to the courthouse victory that had just concluded. The path had been difficult, expensive, and emotionally exhausting, but it had led to justice, not just for my family, but for all of Brenda's victims who had suffered in silence until someone was finally willing to fight back against her systematic manipulation and abuse. The nightmare was over, but the work of healing and rebuilding was just beginning. And for the first time in months, I looked forward to that challenge with optimism and hope for the future Jacob and I would build together. 11 months later, I stood in my kitchen preparing Thanksgiving dinner for a very different family gathering than the one that had exposed Brenda's cruelty the previous year. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been cleaned by Jacob and me together, part of our weekly routine that had replaced the chaos and tension that once characterized our home life. Jacob sat at the breakfast counter working on homework that challenged his newly recognized intellectual abilities, his confidence evident in the way he approached complex problems that would have overwhelmed him when Brenda's medication was clouding his mind and her criticism was undermining his self-worth. Dad, Mrs. Rodriguez says I might be ready for 5th grade math next semester. He announced proudly, showing me calculations that demonstrated the dramatic academic progress he had made since being freed from artificial limitations imposed by someone who claimed to love him. Mrs. Rodriguez had become not just Jacob's teacher, but a family friend who understood the trauma he had overcome and celebrated every milestone in his recovery. Her classroom had become a safe space where his natural curiosity and intelligence could flourish without fear of criticism or medication-induced confusion. The doorbell rang and I opened it to welcome Marcus Sarah and his children Sophia and Emma, who had transformed from entitled and manipulative miniatures of their mother into thoughtful and empathetic young people through therapy and stable family structure. Uncle Thaddeus, we brought the sweet potato casserole, Emma said shyly, still adjusting to honest family relationships, after years of being coached to manipulate and deceive adults to serve their mother's agenda. Sophia carried a handmade card she had created during art therapy, depicting our two families standing together under a bright sun with the words "Grateful for Truth and Family" written in careful 9-year-old handwriting across the bottom. The card represented months of healing work that Marcus had invested in helping his daughters understand the difference between the toxic manipulation they had lived with and genuine family love based on honesty and respect. Their progress reminded me that children were remarkably resilient when removed from harmful influences and provided with consistent support. Mom arrived next carrying flowers and wearing an expression of humility that reflected the difficult journey she had traveled since learning the truth about Brenda's systematic criminal behavior. The guilt she felt for initially supporting Brenda's lies against me had motivated her to enter counseling to understand how her enabling behavior had contributed to the family dysfunction that allowed predatory behavior to flourish unchallenged. "I brought something for you," Mom said quietly, handing me a small wrapped package that contained Dad's favorite woodworking chisel, one of the tools Brenda had stolen and sold online. "Marcus helped me track it down through the original buyer. I thought you should have something of your father's that represents his honest work and integrity." The gesture meant more to me than any expensive gift could have, representing Mom's acknowledgement of the values that should guide family relationships and her commitment to supporting those principles going forward. As we gathered around the dinner table that had been the scene of so much conflict and revelation, I reflected on the lessons that had emerged from our family's darkest period and the strength that came from refusing to enable destructive behavior out of misplaced loyalty. Detective Coleman had stayed in touch throughout the year, sharing updates about the ongoing federal investigation that had expanded to include dozens of similar cases across multiple states. Brenda's conviction had provided a roadmap for other law enforcement agencies investigating family financial crimes, leading to arrests and prosecutions that protected vulnerable people from sophisticated manipulation tactics. The Family Predator Network case has become a training model for investigators learning to recognize patterns of domestic financial abuse, Detective Coleman had told me during our most recent conversation. Your willingness to document evidence and pursue prosecution, despite family pressure, probably prevented hundreds of other people from becoming victims. The knowledge that our painful experience had contributed to protecting others provided meaning and purpose that helped transform trauma into positive action. I had begun volunteering with a support group for family fraud victims, sharing strategies for recognizing manipulation tactics, and finding the courage to pursue legal remedies despite guilt and social pressure. Jacob had also found ways to channel his experience into helping others, giving a presentation at school about the importance of speaking up when adults do things that feel wrong or scary. His courage in revealing Brenda's medication abuse had saved him from further harm while providing crucial evidence that strengthened the criminal case against her. I learned that it's okay to tell the truth, even when it makes people upset. Jacob had told his classmates with wisdom that impressed teachers and parents who attended his presentation. Sometimes adults make bad choices and kids can help by being honest about what's really happening. His words reflected a maturity that came from surviving genuine trauma while maintaining his essential goodness and trust in the adults who truly protected and supported him. The confidence he had gained through academic success and emotional healing made him a natural leader among his peers and a source of pride that no amount of money could have purchased. As we shared the Thanksgiving meal that represented our family's rebirth from the ashes of manipulation and abuse, I offered a toast that captured the gratitude I felt for the journey that had brought us to this point. This year, I'm grateful for the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult and painful. I'm grateful for the people who supported truth over comfortable lies, and for the opportunity to protect the innocent from those who would exploit family bonds for selfish gain. I looked around the table at faces that reflected genuine love and respect, relationships built on honesty rather than manipulation, and support systems based on mutual care rather than exploitation. Most importantly, I'm grateful for the lesson that real love sometimes requires saying no to people who claim to love you. Family isn't about blood relations or shared genetics. Family is about people who build each other up, protect the vulnerable, and choose truth over convenience. Jacob raised his glass of apple cider to join the toast, his bright eyes reflecting understanding of concepts that most children his age wouldn't need to comprehend for many years. I'm grateful that Dad believed me when I told the truth about the pills, and that he protected me even when it was hard. His words reminded me that children notice everything, and that our actions as adults either teach them that truth matters, or that manipulation and lies are acceptable tools for getting what we want. The choice to fight for justice had given Jacob a foundation of integrity that would serve him throughout his life. Marcus added his own gratitude for the opportunity to rebuild his relationship with his daughters based on honesty and respect, rather than the fear and manipulation that Brenda had used to control their family dynamics. I'm grateful that my girls now understand the difference between love and control, and that they're learning to trust their own judgment about what feels right and wrong. As the evening progressed, and our extended family shared stories of healing and growth, I reflected on the deeper lessons that had emerged from our ordeal, and the wisdom that could only come from surviving genuine crisis with integrity intact. The experience had taught me that protecting the people you love sometimes means making enemies of people who claim to love you. Real family doesn't steal, manipulate, or endanger children to maintain comfort and control. Real family builds each other up, rather than tearing others down to feel superior. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, believe them the first time, rather than making excuses or hoping they'll change without consequences. And most importantly, a child's potential should never be dimmed by someone else's insecurity agenda or need for control. Love means protection, not enablement. Supporting someone doesn't mean allowing them to harm others or avoiding accountability for destructive choices. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone's manipulation and hold them responsible for their actions regardless of family relationships or social expectations. The path forward wasn't always easy, but it was honest, and that honesty had created space for genuine healing and growth that wouldn't have been possible under the shadow of Brenda's toxic influence. Jacob's academic success, emotional health, and social confidence proved that children flourish when freed from artificial limitations and systematic undermining of their self-worth. As we cleaned up after dinner and prepared to end our celebration, I realized that the nightmare that began with cruel words at a family dinner had ultimately led to the most authentic and supportive family relationships we had ever experienced. The journey from that terrible Sunday evening to this grateful Thanksgiving had been marked by pain, fear, legal battles, and social pressure that tested every principle I held dear. But it had also revealed strength I didn't know I possessed, allies I hadn't expected to find, and the profound satisfaction that comes from protecting innocence against calculated exploitation. Jacob hugged me goodnight with the unself-conscious affection of a child who felt completely safe and valued, no longer walking on eggshells around adults who might criticize or medicate him for being authentically himself. "Dad, I love our new family traditions," he said sleepily as I tucked him into bed. "Everything feels real now instead of scary and confusing." His words captured the essence of what we had gained by refusing to accept toxic behavior as normal family dysfunction. Reality based on truth was infinitely preferable to false peace based on enabling criminal behavior and allowing vulnerable people to suffer in silence. Standing in my son's doorway, watching him sleep peacefully without the influence of unauthorized medication or psychological manipulation, I felt profound gratitude for the courage that had carried us through the darkness into a life characterized by honesty, respect, and genuine love. The story that began with devastating cruelty had become a testament to the power of standing up for what's right, protecting the innocent, and choosing justice over comfort. And that transformation from victim to victor, from manipulation to authenticity, represented the most valuable lesson I could pass on to my son about what it truly means to be family. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting someone you love from toxic behavior? How do you find the courage to stand up for what's right when it means going against people who claim to care about you? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you or helped you recognize similar patterns in your own life, please give it a like and share it with others who might benefit from understanding the difference between love and manipulation. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about overcoming adversity, finding strength in difficult situations, and protecting the people who matter most. Thank you for joining me on this journey from darkness to light, from manipulation to truth, and from broken family bonds to relationships built on genuine love and respect. May you always have the wisdom to recognize authentic love and the courage to protect it from those who would exploit it for their own selfish gain. Remember that your story matters, your experiences have value, and your voice can make a difference in someone else's journey toward healing and justice. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the people you love, and never let anyone convince you that toxic behavior is normal or acceptable in the name of family loyalty.